Hey fam, recently I had the good fortune of being reunited with an old mentor, somebody that introduced me to literature and poetry, particularly of an Appalachian variety, that really helped show me that somebody that talks like me and thinks like me could maybe make a go of it in college and academia. Certainly had a lot to do with where I am today. And he read to my class in Appalachian Studies a piece of Jim Wayne Miller's Brier sermon that I wanted to share with you today. I feel real awkward making these kinds of videos, and I'm going to be looking at my phone so that I can read to you, but none of that's important. Just listen. Jim Wayne Miller, Appalachian hero. This is his Brier sermon. You must be born again. One Friday night, the Brier felt called to preach. So Saturday morning, early, he appeared on a street corner in town and started preaching, walking up and down the sidewalk in front of a hardware and sporting goods store, back and forth in front of the shotguns and spin casting rods and Coleman camp stoves in the window, and looking across the street to the green stamp redemption store, where all the women bought their trading stamps. Cars and trucks were passing on the street. Women were going in and out of the redemption store, and a few men and boys were standing around in groups of 3 or 4. The Brier knew they were listening, even though they were not looking at him. He took as his text, "You must be born again," and started drawing the people closer, saying, "You may say, 'Preacher, where is your black Bible? Why ain't you preaching down sin?' You may say, 'Preacher, why ain't you talking about hell? What about lipstick and short dresses? What about cigarettes and whiskey? What about dope and long hair?' Well, I didn't bring my Bible for a purpose, because this morning I wanted to say to you, I've been through all the books and come out yon side. I'm educated, but not like the brown boys. Let me tell you about the brown boys. Feller over close to where I live wanted some little cedar trees dug up, planted in a row behind his house. Tried to hire the Johnson boys, his neighbors, but they were too scared to do it. Didn't believe in digging up cedar trees. They'd always heard you'd die whenever the trees got tall enough for their shadow to cover your grave. Get somebody else, they said. Get old Jim and Tim Brown. They're educated, don't believe in nothing. Well, I'm educated, but not like the brown boys. There's something I believe in. You must be born again." When he told about the brown boys, the Brier heard some of the men laugh and say things to one another. Across the street at the redemption store, a woman had come out and stopped, holding a little boy by the hand. The Brier figured the woman and the little boy would like a story too. You hear preachers talk about being lost. What does it mean? What's it got to do with being born again? A feller I know, he didn't go to church, but a church bus always ran right by his house, and his boy, about 5 or 6 years old, wanted to ride it. So he let him go. Little boy got over there in church, and they were having a revival. Preacher knelt down by the little boy, said, "Son, are you lost?" Little boy said yes, for the bus had gone up several creeks and hollers, picking up other people, carried the little boy so far from home, he didn't know where he was. We're not so different from that little boy. We can be lost sitting right in the church house because we've been carried a long way around. We've got so far away from home, we don't know where we are, how we got where we are, how to get home again. I know I wasn't so different from that little boy. In my Father's house, Jesus said, our foreparents left us a home here in the mountains. But we try to live in somebody else's house. We're ashamed to live in our Father's house. We think it's too old-fashioned. Our foreparents left us a very fine inheritance, but we don't believe it. I just want to set you down, gather you together, and read you the will. You've wanted to run off and leave it, this inheritance. You didn't want to see it. Ashamed to hear about it. Thought it wasn't pretty because it wasn't factory made. You put it back in the attic. You've thrown it off in a corner of the barn. Thrown it down into a ditch. In my Father's house. The house our foreparents left had a song, had a story. We didn't care. We said, them old love songs, them old ballads, them old stories and like foolishness. We were too busy anyway, giving our timber away, giving our coal away, to worry about love songs, to worry about ballads, to worry about old stories and like foolishness. But I know a man, he had a song from his foreparents. It got carried off to New York City. And when he heard it played on TV one night by three fellers who clowned and hip swanged, he said he began to feel sick, like he'd lost a loved one. Tears came in his eyes and he went out on the ridge and bawled. Said, Lord, couldn't they leave me the good memories? Now that man wasn't lost, but he knew what he had lost. You've done your best to disremember what all you've lost. You've spoiled the life that's yours by right of inheritance. You have to go around to the back door of the life that belongs to somebody else. You're neither here nor there. You're out in the cold, buddy. But you don't have to live in the past. You can't, even if you try. You don't have to talk old-fashioned, dress old-fashioned. You don't have to live the way your foreparents lived. But if you don't know about them, if you don't love them, if you don't respect them, you're not going anywhere. You don't have to think ridge to ridge the way they did. You can think ocean to ocean. You say, I'm not going to live in the past. And all the time, the past is living in you. If you're lost, I say it's because you're not living in your Father's house. It's the only house you've got, the only shelter you've got. It may be just a mountain cabin, but it's shelter, and it's yours. I left my Father's house. Oh, I was moving. But I noticed I wasn't getting anywhere. I was living in somebody else's house. I kept stepping out somebody else's door, and the roads I traveled kept winding, twisting, had no beginning, no end. My own house, heired to me by my foreparents, was right there all the time. Yours is too. But I wasn't living in it. Well, I went home. And when I stepped out of my own front door, when I knew where I was starting from, I knew then where I was going. The only road I could go was the road that started from my own front door. In my Father's house. That's what the Bible says. And it speaks of the sins of the fathers visited on the children. Unto the fourth generation, says the sins of the fathers. Will set the children's teeth on edge. You're probably wondering why I wasn't talking about sin. Well, I am. But I say forget the sins of the fathers. What about the sins of the sons and the daughters? We've got enough sins of our own to think about. We're able to set our own teeth on edge. Ours is the sin of forgetfulness. Forgetfulness of the fathers. Forgetfulness of a part of ourselves makes us less than we ought to be, less than we could be. Forgetfulness of the fathers makes us a people who hardly cast a shadow upon the ground. You've heard it said you can't put old wine in new bottles. You can't put new wine in old bottles. Well, I don't know. But don't be too sure you're new wine. Maybe we're all old wine in new bottles. Brier was walking up and down the sidewalk in front of the hardware and sporting goods store, passing back and forth in front of the guns and fishing rods and catalytic heaters, and a good crowd was gathering across the street in front of the Redemption store. He was pacing to the corner and back, stopping to lay hand on a parking meter. Traffic was increasing in the street. Some of the people passing nodded or waved a hand, for they knew the Brier. He nodded and waved back. When the light stopped traffic in the street, he stood on the balls of his feet and talked across the tops of the cars to the crowd in front of the Redemption store. The light would turn and the traffic would move on. Cars and pickup trucks, motorcycles, RVs pulling boats. The boy parked his wide-tired, jacked-up car at the first parking meter in front of the Brier, got out and went into the hardware store. The Brier moved down and talked across the car's hood. I see these boys with their old cars jerked up on a pulley out under a tree somewhere. I see the cars looking like monster beasts, have these boys' heads bit off, half of their bodies already eaten up. I see them lying flat on their backs with their heads up under cars, nothing but their feet is sticking out, their hands mucking around in grease and gears. And I think, buddy, that's how America's got you. That's just the view you have of this country. You've had your head eat off, or else you're flat on your back, looking up into the guts and gears of America, up to your elbows in her moving parts, flat of your back, always looking up. And I think to myself, I'd like to open up your heads, just like you raise the hood or go into a gearbox. I'd like to rewire your heads, and gap your spark plugs, and reset your timing. Because you can get off your back. You can have a new view. You can get behind the wheel of America. You can sit in the smooth, upholstered seats of power and listen to the music playing. But first you've got to come home, live in your father's house, step out your own front door. There's a road back, buddy. Let me go back a little. Let me tell you how we got in this fix in the first place. Our people settled in these mountains and lived pretty much to themselves. When we got back in touch, we started seeing we had to catch up with the others. And people came in telling us, you've got to run. You've got to catch up. Buddy, we've run so fast, we've run off and left ourselves. We've run off and left the best part of ourselves. And here's something peculiar. Running, we met people on the road coming from where we were headed. Wild-eyed people running away from something. We said, what do you have? And it turned out they were running away from what we were running after. They were on their way to sit a spell with us. We had something they wanted. When they got here, a lot of us weren't home. We'd already run off and left ourselves. So they set to picking up all the things we'd already cast off. Our songs, our stories, our whole way of life. We couldn't see the treasures in our own house, but they could, and they picked up what we'd abandoned. You say, preacher, you must be touched. That's foolishness. How can anybody run off and leave himself? I say, don't ask me. You're the one who's done it. You've kept the worst and thrown away the best. You've stayed the same where you ought to have changed where you ought to have stayed the same. Wouldn't you like to know what to throw away, what to keep, what to be ashamed of, what to be proud of? Wouldn't you like to know how to change and stay the same? You must be born again. Say you were going on a trip knowing you wouldn't ever be coming back, and all that you'd ever have of the place you knew, the place where you'd always lived, was what you could take with you. You'd want to think what to take along, what would travel well, what you'd really need and wouldn't need. I'm telling you, every day you're leaving a place that you won't be coming back to ever. What are you going to leave behind? What are you taking with you? Don't run off and leave the best part of yourself. And what is that best part? It's spirit. I tell you, I know places in these mountains, back off the big roads, up the coves and hollers, old home places with barns and apple orchards, cattle gaps, haunted by spirits, Spirits of people who left there, taking everything with them but their spirits, for their spirits wouldn't leave that place. And their spirits are there yet, like half-wild dogs or cats that will live on around a place after the people are gone. And I know other places in our towns and cities where the people have moved to without their spirits. Do you believe in signs? I do. I believe in signs. And when I see people living in dirt, living in filth and trash, I believe it's a sign. I believe it's a sign that the spirits of those people are living somewhere else. For a spirit won't live in filth and nastiness. Spirit keeps its own place clean, like around a fox's den, when little foxes come out and play in the evening, and it's clean around the den. Yes, foxes have their dens, but what do we have? We've lost the ground from underneath our feet, lost the spiritual ground. We've run off and left the best part of ourselves. We've moved to the cities, moved to town, left our spirits in the mountains to live like half-wild dogs around the home place. You say, preacher, we have to change. That's right. But we're forgetful. It's our forgetfulness that's a sin against ourselves. We don't know any more about our history than a dog knows about its daddy. We're ignorant of ourselves, confused in what little we do know. All we know is what other folks have told us. They've said, you're fine Anglo-Saxons, pioneer stock. Then we went to the cities. They said we were trash, said we were Briers. They said, you're proud and independent. They said, you're narrow-minded. They said, you're right from the heart of America. They said, you're the worst part of America. They said, we ought to be more like you. They said, you ought to be more like us. You've heard that prayer that goes, help us to see ourselves as others see us. Buddy, that's not a prayer we want to pray. I believe we ought to pray, Lord, help us to see ourselves and no more. Or maybe help us to see ourselves, help us to be ourselves, help us to free ourselves from seeing ourselves as others see us. I know it's hard to turn loose of that old self, that confused self. You think that's the only thing I am, what someone else has told me I am. I've hung there, I know. I've twisted in that wind, but you can turn loose. You can do it. One dark night in the fall of the year, the man went out to coon hunt, went all by himself. His dogs, they struck a trail, and he followed up the ridge, stopping to listen, moving on, moving through the dark. And when his dogs barked, treed way over yonder, he hurried on through the brush, moving faster, and walked, yes, walked right over a cliff. You'll do that in these mountains if you're not careful. Well, he managed to grab a hold as he went over. A little twisty, runny tree was growing out from a crack in the cliff, and he hung by it, held on in the dark. They couldn't do anything but just hang there. He couldn't get back up. There was no footing, and nothing but death and darkness there below him. But he couldn't hold on much longer either. Finally, all the strength in his hands was gone. He couldn't hold on any longer, and he fell about a foot. Yes, fell about a foot. He'd hung on as long as he could. He'd held on to dear life, just as anybody will. Having no choice, he turned loose of his life. But he didn't lose it. He didn't lose himself. He found himself on firm ground. And he went home. But he went home a changed man. You're hanging like that man. You're struggling for a toehold in the dark. You're holding on to that old self, but your grip is growing weaker all the time. Turn loose. All you'll do is fall about a foot. You'll fall about a foot to spiritual ground. You'll fall home. You'll walk away a different man or woman. Oh, you'll think I'm going to die, but you won't die. I'm not talking about physical death. When you die a physical death, You're put into the ground. And the Bible teaches you'll be raised up, resurrected from that physical death. But I'm not talking about physical death. I'm talking about spiritual death. I'm not talking about life after death. I'm talking about life before death. I'm saying if you're dead in life, spiritually dead in life, you must be born again. You must be born again and again and again. You say, preacher, what's it like? I'm here to tell you, it's like becoming a little child again, but being grown up too. It's the best of both. It's being at home everywhere. It's living in your own house. It's stepping out your own front door every morning. It's being old wine in a new bottle. It's getting to know another side of yourself. You know how sometimes when you squirrel hunt, a squirrel will get on the backside of a tree, and if you step around there, he just goes around to the side of the tree where you were standing. And if you step back around to that side again, he goes to the side where he was in the first place, and on, and you never get him that way. You've got a side of yourself that's like that squirrel, always out of sight. What's it like being born again? It's going back to what you were before, without losing what you've since become. They say people can go blind gradually. They say people can go deaf gradually, lose their sense of taste little by little. They forget the shapes of leaves on trees, forget the sound of the creek running. The world just blurs, goes silent. They forget the taste of coffee and all their food. Now, what would it be like if that sight were given back? If they heard the creek running again or a crow call? If suddenly they could taste their food again? Something is restored to them, a richness. They found something they didn't even know they'd lost. They're born again to sights and sounds and tastes. Oh, you must be born again. Do you remember back when you were little and wore brogans or heavy shoes all winter? And do you remember that first day in spring when you took them off and started going barefoot? The air was warm, but the ground was still so cool. Your feet were white and tender, but you felt light-footed. You had good wind, and you felt like you could fly right off the earth. You must be born again. The crowd had scattered now. The street was almost empty when he finished. He stood a moment like a blind man, smiling and gazing past people he spoke to. Then he reached out as if to gather something in, and raising his hand higher still, he blessed an invisible crowd on the sidewalk. Traffic stopped at the light, and the Brier on the corner disappeared behind a motorhome. When it pulled away, he had gone.